The scent of rose oil and burning incense couldn't quite mask the metallic tang in the air. In the marble corridors of a Roman villa at dusk, where oil lamps cast dancing shadows on frescoed walls, the line between public virtue and private reality was being drawn. This was a world where a senator's wife could be celebrated for her modesty, while her face was painted with poisonous lead, and where whispered conversations between a domina and her slave girls, planning the next day's beauty rituals, held undercurrents of power, coercion, and profound social control. The intimate lives of the ancient Romans were governed by a framework so alien to modern sensibilities that it challenges our very assumptions about human nature. These weren't hidden perversions, they were the unspoken rules of civilization, woven into the social fabric, supported by law, religion, and custom, creating a society where power dynamics, gender roles, and human sexuality operated according to a brutal, fascinating, and meticulously maintained code. For a Roman woman of status, her body was not entirely her own. It was a symbol of her family's honor, and her behavior was dictated by the complex concept of pudicitia. This was far more than simple chastity. It was a precise, performative balance of availability and restraint, a tightrope walk where a single misstep could lead to social ruin. A senator's wife needed to be sexually available to her husband to produce legitimate heirs, while remaining utterly inaccessible to all other men, not as a matter of personal choice, but as a reflection of her husband's political standing and virtue. The legendary Livia Drusilla, wife of Emperor Augustus, was the ultimate master of this performance, becoming the public template for Roman feminine virtue. Yet, historical accounts suggest that behind her impeccable public facade, she maintained a sophisticated network of informants, many of them slave girls and attendants from prominent households. These whispers from the most private chambers, the bedchamber secrets and intimate habits of her husband's rivals were not mere gossip. They were political currency. In Rome, the personal was always political, and the secrets of the body could be leveraged to topple governments and secure dynasties. This calculated approach extended to the very foundation of Roman society, marriage. Among the elite, matrimony was rarely about love. It was a negotiation, a strategic alliance between families designed to consolidate wealth, forge political partnerships, and, most importantly, produce legitimate male heirs. Love, if it blossomed at all, was considered a fortunate accident, a pleasant bonus in a transaction that was, at its core, a business arrangement. The pressure on the wedding night was immense, often marking the first time the couple met in true privacy. Pliny the Younger, in a letter from 97 AD, described the terror of a young bride, barely 14, as her mother and aunts prepared her for the ceremony that would transform her from a child into a wife in a single evening. Her husband, a man 20 years her senior, waited in the adjoining chamber. The marriage bed itself was a sacred stage, blessed by the household gods, sprinkled with sacred water, and draped in a specific shade of red, a color chosen not for romance, but for its practicality in hiding the bloodied evidence of her virginity's end. This rigid social order was built upon a legal and sexual hierarchy that categorized people not just by gender, but by their station. Citizens, non-citizens, slaves, freedmen, and foreigners all occupied distinct rungs on a ladder that dictated their sexual roles and expectations. A Roman citizen man faced little social censure for engaging with slaves, prostitutes, or foreigners. These interactions were considered a natural extension of his power. However, any sexual involvement with the wife or daughter of another citizen was a transgression of the highest order, a threat to the social fabric that could carry a death sentence. The tragic fate of Gaius Silius, who dared to marry Emperor Claudius's wife, Valeria Messalina, in 48 AD, while the emperor was away, is a stark example. The crime was not merely adultery, it was the audacious challenge to imperial authority and the pollution of the royal bloodline. Claudius's return sealed their fate, proving that in Rome, sexual transgression was often a proxy for political treason. Within this world, the slave was the ultimate instrument of intimate life. A household slave was considered an extension of their owner's body, available for use without consent or legal recourse. The wealthy maintained specialized slaves for every aspect of private life. Cosmetae for beauty treatments, cubicularii for bedroom service, and concubinae for ongoing sexual relationships that existed parallel to formal marriages. The fabulously wealthy Marcus Crassus, in the 1st century BC, was said to have owned over 500 slaves in his urban household alone, many selected for their physical beauty and trained in arts that extended far beyond domestic service. In the flickering light of evening gatherings, these slaves performed, their bodies and talents, creating a world where entertainment, worship, and sexual exploitation were inextricably and publicly linked. They were the living, breathing proof that in the Roman world, the most intimate acts were never just private. They were a demonstration of power, a transaction, and a deeply ingrained feature of a civilization that defies simple judgment. If the Roman elite home was a stage for the performance of power, then the city's backstreets and private chambers were its factories, producing the very commodities of beauty and pleasure that fueled that performance. This was a world of stark contrasts, where the pursuit of idealized beauty mandated the slow poisoning of the body, and the commerce of sex was as regulated and mundane as the trade in grain or pottery. In the shadows of grand temples and basilicas, the relentless Roman pragmatism transformed human intimacy and physical appearance into systems of brutal, calculated efficiency. The most visible manifestation of this was the Roman sex trade, a legally recognized industry integrated seamlessly into the urban fabric. Prostitution was not a hidden vice but a taxed and regulated commerce. Roman law distinguished between different classes of sex workers. The meretrix registered prostitutes who worked in brothels and paid taxes, the ancilla slave women whose services were rented out by their owners, and the femina women of higher birth who had fallen into disgrace and informal prostitution. The ruins of Pompeii, preserved under volcanic ash, offer a frozen snapshot of this world. The city's brothels were not hidden alleys but identifiable buildings, their stone cubicles barely large enough for a narrow bed. The walls were adorned with explicit frescoes depicting various sexual acts, serving as both menu and advertisement for a largely illiterate clientele. The graffiti scrawled on these walls by patrons crude reviews, boasts, and occasionally, poignant expressions of affection for a particular woman named Restituta speak to a system that was both deeply impersonal and, at times, surprisingly human. In the Subura district of Rome, the empire's largest red light district, the lines between social classes blurred after dark. Senators and even priests, disguised in common tunics with their rings hidden, would navigate the crowded, lantern-lit streets, partaking in pleasures that their public virtues officially condemned. By dawn, they would return to their villas and their respectable lives, the night's activities confined to a separate, unspoken world. This commercial exchange was mirrored by a more insidious, internal commerce within the homes of the elite. The trade in beauty. For a Roman matron, her appearance was a public declaration of her husband's wealth and status, and the rituals to maintain it were as demanding as they were dangerous. The pursuit of the fashionable pale complexion involved applying a thick paste of white lead and vinegar directly to the face, a practice that led to chronic lead poisoning, causing neurological damage, infertility, and a slow, painful death. Lips were stained a vibrant crimson using compounds derived from mercury, a neurotoxin that destroyed the nervous system over years of use. The Roman poet Ovid, in his Ars Amatoria, provided detailed recipes for these cosmetics that read like a manual for gradual suicide. The pain extended beyond poisoning. Depilation, the removal of all body hair, was an agonizing obsession for both men and women. Specialized slave alipilari would use heated bronze tweezers, pine resin waxes, and abrasive pumice stones to strip hair from the skin, often leaving it raw and bleeding. The poet Martial captured this stoic suffering in a description of a senator's wife, enduring a session in silence, tears streaming down her cheeks as she maintained the expressionless composure demanded of her station. This control over the body extended to its most fundamental functions, reproduction. In a society where women had limited legal rights, the desperate attempt to control fertility led them to embrace methods that were often as lethal as the cosmetics they wore. The silphium plant, harvested to extinction from the North African coast, was so valued for its contraceptive properties that its image was stamped on coins. Women consumed it in various preparations, but its potency made overdose a frequent and fatal risk. The Greek physician Soranus of Ephesus, practicing in 2nd century Rome, clinically documented other harrowing methods in his gynecology: wool plugs soaked in acidic honey or cedar resin inserted before intercourse, potions made from copper sulfate, iron rust, or crushed beetles, and even recommendations for violent exercise or deliberate falls to induce miscarriage. The tone of his writing masks the sheer desperation of women navigating a system that offered them no safe alternatives. When these methods failed, women turned to abortion, which Roman law permitted, viewing the fetus as part of the mother's body. The procedures, however, were brutal. Women consumed toxic herbs like pennyroyal and savin, which induced miscarriage by poisoning the entire system, or they submitted to mechanical interventions using bronze instruments that frequently caused fatal hemorrhaging or infection. Pliny the Elder recorded one such tragedy. A wealthy woman, weakened by ineffective herbs, finally allowed a Greek physician to use his instruments. The pregnancy was terminated, but infection set in days later. She died in agony, her family inventing a story of a sudden fever to conceal the shameful truth. In the Roman world, the female body was a battlefield, where the war for social standing and personal autonomy was fought with poisonous paints, painful procedures, and lethal potions. Beneath the polished surface of Roman society flowed deep and complex undercurrents of desire that defied simple categorization. Roman intimacy was not a matter of binary orientations, but an intricate map of power, where social status dictated one's role in any encounter. This hierarchy was enforced with brutal consistency, from the highest echelons of imperial power to the most private philosophical debates, revealing a culture obsessed with dominance and submission in all spheres of life, including the most personal. The Roman perspective on homosexuality was a world apart from modern understanding. It was not about the gender of one's partner, but about the power dynamic inherent in the act. For a Roman citizen man, taking the active, dominant role with a social inferior, be they a male slave, a foreigner, or a young male prostitute, was socially acceptable and often celebrated as a demonstration of virility. The passive role, however, was associated with weakness and femininity, and for a citizen to be perceived as such was a profound social disgrace that could destroy a political career. The most famous example of this cultural weaponization of sexuality were the persistent rumors that dogged Julius Caesar throughout his life, alleging that in his youth he had been the passive partner to King Nicomedes IV of Bithynia. His political enemies never tired of calling him the Queen of Bithynia, using the accusation to imply he lacked the masculine authority required to lead Rome. The truth of the claim was irrelevant. Its power to damage his reputation was undeniable. Even an emperor was not immune to these judgments. Hadrian's profound, public grief for his young lover Antinous, who drowned in the Nile in 130 AD, was viewed by many contemporaries not as a tragic romance, but as an undignified and un-Roman display of emotional vulnerability. By surrendering so completely to his grief, Hadrian was seen to have compromised the stoic, dominant bearing expected of a ruler. This rigid control of public image found its release in the sanctioned chaos of religious festivals, where social norms were deliberately inverted. The Floralia, held each April in honor of the goddess Flora, was a riot of sexuality and abandon. The festival featured nude dancing, theatrical performances with explicit sexual content, and public acts of coupling believed to encourage agricultural fertility. While respectable married women typically avoided the spectacle, prostitutes, slaves, and freedwomen participated with enthusiasm. The poet Martial, describing the Floralia of 88 AD, noted the hypocrisy of citizens who would publicly condemn such behavior, yet packed the theaters to cheer wildly. Senators sat beside slaves, all pretending that religious duty, and not prurient curiosity, had brought them to witness performers coupling on stage to the sound of sacred hymns. It was a controlled explosion, a safety valve that ultimately reinforced the very social hierarchies it temporarily suspended. This duality between public law and private behavior was further codified in the institution of marriage itself, which existed in several distinct legal forms. The most binding was conferitio, a sacred ceremony reserved for the patrician elite, involving elaborate religious rites and making divorce nearly impossible. Coemptio, a marriage by purchase, was a more common formal arrangement that symbolically transferred the bride from her father's authority to her husband's. For the masses, there was usus, a marriage created simply by cohabitation for a full year. These different forms created a spectrum of relationships with varying degrees of legal protection, particularly for women. Divorce, while legally simple to initiate, carried devastating social and financial consequences for women, who faced ostracism and the potential loss of their children and dowry. The state's interest in regulating this most private of institutions was made starkly clear by Emperor Augustus's Lex Julia de Maritandis Ordinibus in 18 BC. This law, designed to encourage marriage and procreation among the elite by penalizing celibacy and childlessness, backfired spectacularly. It led to a flurry of fake marriages and legal loopholes, as wealthy Romans arranged sham unions with absent partners or married slave women only to immediately free them, reducing a sacred institution to a legal technicality to be gamed for personal and political advantage. The intimate customs of Rome were not confined to bedrooms and brothels. They were the lifeblood of the empire itself, pulsing through its military camps, its economy, its fields, and its very philosophy. From the moment a Roman boy came of age to the day he was laid in his tomb, his identity and his society's stability were profoundly shaped by the rules of intimacy and the power dynamics they enforced. The personal was not just political, it was imperial. The journey into this world began early. Roman sexual education was a practical, often brutal, affair. Boys learned from older male relatives, tutors, and, most directly, through experience with slaves made available to them. The toga virilis ceremony, held when a boy turned 16, formally marked his transition to manhood. Beyond the public sacrifices and declarations lay private, often institutionalized, initiations. Archaeological evidence and texts suggest these frequently included visits to brothels or arranged encounters, teaching young citizens their prescribed dominant role in the sexual hierarchy. For girls, instruction came from mothers and married female relatives, focusing not on pleasure but on submission, endurance, and the production of legitimate heirs. The poet Catulus's passionate, then vengeful, poems to his lover Lesbia reveal that deep emotional bonds could form, but even the most intense romance was shadowed by the societal expectation of power. When the relationship soured, his verses turned violently misogynistic, threatening sexual domination as retaliation for emotional injury. This culture of dominance was exported with the legions. Roman military conquest was not just a matter of territory but of bodies. The rape of captured women was considered a natural rite of victory, a tactic of terror and a reward for soldiers. As Caesar himself noted in his Gallic Wars, after the siege of Alesia, captured women were distributed among the officers and men, for purposes that military discipline usually forbade, but victory temporarily permitted. Back home, the management of slaves extended to their most intimate lives. Masters controlled relationships, forbade marriages, and separated families at will. Some estates even maintained detailed breeding programs, records of which read like livestock inventories, designed to produce slaves with specific physical or intellectual traits. The emotional toll was immense, yet bonds still formed in this oppressive environment. Pliny the Younger wrote movingly of his deceased slave, Zosimus, calling him a companion and a beloved friend, freeing Zosimus's son in his grief. A small personal act of humanity within a vast, inhuman system. These contradictions were reflected in Roman philosophy and death. Stoics like Emperor Marcus Aurelius preached the mastery of desire, viewing it as a dangerous fire that must be contained. Meanwhile, Epicureans cautiously accepted pleasure, so long as it was chosen wisely. This debate extended beyond life itself. Funeral monuments often depicted couples reclining together, the wife's hand on her husband's chest in a gesture of eternal fidelity. Some tombs, however, contained more explicit imagery and objects for intimate use, suggesting a belief that pleasure could transcend death. Even farmers believed human sexuality influenced the land, timing their planting and harvesting to coincide with their own sexual activities in a form of sympathetic magic to ensure fertile crops. Standing in the ruins of Pompeii today, the echo of these ancient whispers is unmistakable. The volcanic ash that preserved the city also preserved a mirror, reflecting an uncomfortable truth back at us. The Romans were not monsters. They were humans operating within a cultural framework that normalized inequality, exploitation, and violence in the most private aspects of life. Their civilization gifted the world roads, laws, and aqueducts, but it was built on a foundation where the bodies of slaves, women, and the conquered were instruments of power. The distance between their world and ours is smaller than we might believe. We have simply developed new languages and more sophisticated customs to veil the transactions, inequalities, and manipulations that continue to shape human intimacy. The ghosts of Pompeii remind us that love has never been free from power, and that every culture's sexual customs reveal its deepest, most unspoken values about who is truly human. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the heart of the Roman world. If these forgotten stories of intimacy and power resonated with you, please give this video a like and subscribe for more content that uncovers history's hidden truths. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Let us know where you're watching from. It's incredible to connect with you across time and space, united by a shared curiosity about the past.